Hi everyone, welcome to another edition of the Sfarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Professor Adam Silverstein, who holds the Max Schlesinger Chair of Islamic Studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And we'll be discussing his new book titled Haman, a Biography, published by Princeton University Press. So thank you, Professor Silverstein, for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start off, tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
Well, I teach at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. I am a professor of Islamic studies, but most of my teaching is what we would call Abrahamic religions. It's the study of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam as they have developed together in conversation with each other. And so it's basically religious studies with a particular focus on Islam, but I'm very, very much fascinated by the interaction between Judaism and Islam, and perhaps that'll come up in our chat.
Yeah, I'm sure at some point. That's something that's discussed pretty extensively in the book. Okay, so I'm sure listeners seeing the title of this book, of this podcast, and they're like, wait, biography of Haman? What's going on?
Well, the Megillah is probably the most historical book in Tanakh. It's the one that, on the one hand, tells us that it's historical. If you don't, if you want to confirm what is in this story, go and read non-biblical sources. Go to the Chronicles of the Medians and the Persians, and you'll find it there. So it does kind of present itself as history, and there's a lot of things inside, like dates and names and place names and titles of different functionaries. It very much, to somebody who doesn't know about religious literature, just looks like a history book. And even more interesting from my point of view is that the things that you would expect from a holy book aren't there. So obviously there's no reference to Hashem, there's no reference to miracles, to davening, it very much looks like it was trying not to act like a religious book. So we do have a reason to think that every single aspect of this book is historical, so why not write a biography of this historical character? That's one answer. Another answer is that a biography is basically the story of someone's life. And different people tell the story differently. And I'm interested to know on how different communities, not just Jews, Christians, and Muslims, and even Samaritans in some cases, but different groups of Jews in different times and places will have described Haman differently, will have told his story differently. So Jews, for instance, living under the Christian Roman Empire, were imagining their biggest bogeyman, their biggest rival as a Christian Edomite, a Roman, because that's what scared them at the time. So that's the language that people used. And of course, Jews living under Islamic rule would have thought of Haman differently. Jews living under medieval European rule had different things to say. So Haman's story changes based on who's telling the story. So that's the sort of biography that fills most of the book. But I will level with you and say that at some point I do try to tell his story, taking all the midrashim together and lay it all out there. What do we know about Haman based on mostly Jewish sources? And each reader can do with this what they want. So my aim in the book is not to tell people what to think; it's to give them the tools to come up with their own ideas about Haman. And I've done all the kind of the heavy lifting. I've gone through literally thousands of sources in all sorts of languages from different cultures, and I think there's enough there to understand Haman, each person from his own perspective.
And the point that you make in the book, in the first chapter, is that without Haman, there's no Esther story. So the protagonists might be Mordechai and Esther, and Achashverosh appears earlier, and Haman doesn't appear until third parak. But I don't know if you want to emphasize this here. Without Haman, there is no story, as opposed to if technically by the story itself, just by reading Esther, if you removed Mordechai and Esther, potentially the story would still go.
Absolutely. I think that the only character who's there pretty much the whole time is Achashverosh. He's there in the first chapter, he's there in the last chapter, and he's there in between. Mordechai and Esther are only introduced in Parak Bet. Esther disappears after Parak Tet. Mordechai is there, but you really do have two heroes, and you can do with only one of them. Mordechai has a personal rivalry with Haman. He doesn't bow, and Haman gets angry at the Jews. But if you took Mordechai and his rivalry with Haman out, you still have Esther as a heroine who becomes effectatious for the Jews by becoming the queen in her own way. She wins a beauty contest. But the point is, you really need only one of the heroes. But if you take the villain out, there's no tension. There's no threat. You don't have to find a hero who's going to undo the threat. You don't have to celebrate the fact that the threat passed. It's just Jews in the Persian Empire. And the example I like to use is Ala Nisim, right? So in benching or in davening, you add this kind of very, very potted summary of the story, really 2 lines. And how is it told? We are told that things happened not in the days of Achashverosh, they happened in the days of Mordechai and Esther, and then you don't hear about them at all again. You just hear about Haman tried to do something to the Jews, and you, God, foiled the plot. So the 2 sides are Haman and Hashem. And as a summary of Esther, I mean, as a college essay, that's not a great summary because we know that Hashem's not in the story. And Mordechai and Esther are supposed to be much more active, not just that things happened in their day. But the point is that really what the story boils down to is that there was a threat against the Jews and Ala Nisim, there were miracles, maybe not overt, that helped us negotiate this threat. So again, Ala Nisim basically proves the point that you don't really need Mordechai and Esther or even Achashverosh for the story. But without Haman, there's no story, there's no drama.
So I'm sure listeners are familiar with Haman in Esther. But let's give an overview of Haman, as you know, as you went through many sources, but focusing on Esther and Chazal and the Hebrew sources, I guess, before we turn to other sources, what's the overview, I guess, the portrait you can paint of Haman?
Well, this is going to sound like a cop-out, but it depends. It depends on the period, the place, the time, the author, and you get a lot of Hamans, even within, you would say, rabbinic Judaism. So let's start from the beginning. What are our sources? So we have the Megillah itself. Fine. The Megillah raises all sorts of riddles and questions, probably consciously. And the way that people solve these riddles or respond to questions has been different over time. So Midrashim is mostly what we have, and there are more Midrashim about Esther than about any other book of the Bible, aside from Bereshit. So this is amazing. This is telling us that there are a lot of answers. And when you have a lot of answers, then you could work backwards and say, well, there were a lot of questions here. And the other thing about Esther, which doesn't even apply to Bereshit, is that it's the only book of Tanakh that has a running commentary on the whole book in the Gemara. You don't have that for any other book. So we have this very, very detailed and very consistent and kind of disciplined rabbinic treatment of the whole story and specifically of Haman within it. So because we have this very, very large pile of Midrashim, we have all sorts of details about Haman that, how shall I put this, aren't in the lines, they're more between the lines. And because there's this flexibility, where was he from? What did he do before he became Mishneh LaMelech? All of these questions are open to interpretation. So if you have a story that has pretty much all of the details in the psukim themselves, then it's hard to play around with the details because they're already there. But when you have so many gaps, then different people would fill them differently over time. So if you ask, where was Haman from? You'll have a piyut that will say he was from Kfar Kartsum. You'll have somebody say he was a Gagite, means an Amalekite. There are things that tell us he was from Persia, from Egypt. There are all sorts of options because the text itself doesn't say, and he was from there. And either winks at us through Agagi or doesn't say anything. So that's why we get all this diversity, which for me is what makes it interesting. But for, I think, many people, it makes it confusing or perplexing. But don't get me wrong, this is the one story of the Tanakh, maybe aside from the Mabul, that you can teach kids from when they're 5 years old and they'll get it. There's no korbanot and it's very, very streamlined. It's a kind of Cinderella story. There was the bad guys, the good guys. It was scary, but Hashem saved us. There's a very simple way of telling it, but there's also a very complicated way of getting into it. And I think that we see this from the very high pile of midrashim that have piled up over the centuries.
Yeah, so there's really a lot to say on Haman, as you say, and the book really goes through different chapters and kind of jumps around different things. I think, for the book, we'll come back to the other sources. I mean, you have the Septuagint, and then there's Josephus, and there's all sorts of areas, as you mentioned, the Quran, you have Islam is something you're interested in. So there's a lot of interesting other versions of Haman. But let's talk about a little bit more about Haman specifically. As you mentioned, all the Midrashim, Targum Sheni, Gemara Masechet Megillah. I mean, everyone familiar with some of these Midrashim, to some of these various explanations and kind of facts about Haman. But as a historical figure, as you look through, you mentioned Agagite is the Amalekite, but then we know Hamdasa, it's a Persian name. You want to talk about some of that, like what you discussed, and this is something that you analyzed a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, Haman incredibly, is the person about whom we know the most in the Megillah. We know what he was thinking. We know the name of his wife and his sons. We know the name of his father. We don't know these details about any other character. I mean, we know some of them about some of the characters, but he's the person about whom we know the most. He's the most three-dimensional character. And using the name of his father and his 10 sons that we have, we don't really have to guess too much about what their ethnicity was, or at least what their culture was. Because these are names that a scholar of ancient Persian who knows nothing about Tanakh, nothing about Jewish history, will look at these names and say, this is a Persian. He's the son of a Persian. He's the father of Persians. These are Persian names. And you can, what's the word? You can look at them etymologically and unpack what each name means. And so that's pretty straightforward.
All those names that we see, they're all Persian names. So even if, like we're saying, Haman is an Amalekite, but culturally, he became, the family was a Persian family.
Or vice versa. You could say that they sort of like Esther and Hadassah, she has the Hebrew name and she has the local name, what's your name? Alexander, but give me Nelia under the name Aryeh. They're living in Galut. And that's a reality that may be true of Amalekites also. Maybe they had separate names, but Haman HaGagi tells us that the background to this guy is Amalekite, and he's living in the Persian Empire, and he's well acculturated, and he's chosen names for his sons that make them locals. And I think that's something that we, as Jews, with our 2,000 years in Galut, know how to negotiate, and we can sympathize with that.
So if you had to say, I mean, it's hard to say, but if you had to say, where was Haman from?
Look, this is going to be a cop-out. Again, it depends who you ask, and it depends what I mean by from. In terms of Haman's genealogy, there's no doubt, almost no doubt, that the author of the Megillah wants to associate him with the Amalekites. Because of the word Agagi, which relates to Agag, who's both in Devarim and also especially in the story of Shaul and Agag. This is pretty clear. But not only does the name Agagi, this kind of epithet, hint at the Amalekite connection, but the story of Esther appears to be kind of tying up loose threads left over from the story of Shaul and Agag. So a lot of the things that we hear in Perek Tet about, and they took revenge, so to speak, on the people with the men, women, and the animals. This is something that specifically Shaul was supposed to do at the time, didn't do, and here we're fixing some of the problems that were left over from that story. So it's almost like a very clear conversation between that episode of Jewish Amalekite relations and the one that's happening during the days of Achashverosh. So I think it's pretty clear that the author of the Megillah, whether it's Mordechai and Esther, the Anshe Knesset, doesn't matter who's writing this. They are assuming that we know about previous episodes of Jewish Amalekite relations and are seeing this in that from that perspective. So I think he is meant to be an Amalekite in terms of his role in Jewish history. If he did one of these DNA reveal tests that people do now, what would it turn out? I don't know. But he was certainly presenting himself on the Persian street as one of the Persians. Interestingly, in different versions of the Esther story, we get different answers to this. So, for instance, in the Septuagint, which obviously is associated now with non-Jewish readers of Tanakh, but was written by a Jew about 100 years before Christianity. So this is another Jewish version of Esther. He is described as a Macedonian, a Greek, so who is not of Persian blood. So it's very clear that one of the accusations against Haman in that text are that he was just pretending. He presented himself as this Persian, one of the people, but he was really a Greek. But a Greek is not an Amalekite. A Greek, okay, he was another sort of enemy of the Jews in that period. I get it. But if you're asking the author and audience of that text 100 years before Christianity, Jews writing for other Jews, their answer wasn't Amalekite. Their answer was Macedonian. He was a Greek.
By the way, we should mention the Septuagint for those who aren't familiar with Targum HaShivim. We're talking about the Greek translation of the Torah. So, and we can talk more about that in a second. And as you mentioned, Haman's DNA, that's what you termed the chapter, Haman's DNA. You have a lot of fun with the chapters and the subtitles as well, with the You have some fun of where I think you say Esther is from Mars, Haman is from Venus at one point, and then you also Haman's career. We can talk about Haman's career for a minute. You have what was Haman's career before, especially before this. So you have from rags to riches, Haman's early career, and then from riches to rags. So you can kind of again, this is something that I'm sure to some extent listeners are familiar with. Midrash, it's various Midrashim and Gemara and Megillah talk about. There's a barber and so on. But if you want to talk about some of Haman's career, so to speak.
So yeah, look, I tried to have a lot of fun with the story, both because I spent a very long time with it, and just to keep my interest going, I was very much having fun with it. But also, it is a fun story, and I remember as a child being told this story as a big threat to the Jewish people and history, and there's a fast beforehand. But with time, I've come to see it more as a comedy, a farce, something that's kind of more meant to be read with a smile, because we know that it ends well. And the person who wrote it knows that it ends well. And the people who heard it, continue to hear it every year, twice, do so wearing costumes with groggers and having a good time. They're not sitting there, biting their fingernails saying, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? There's not a lot of suspense. It's much more of a kind of carnival, happy, adula. This is a fun book, a fun story with a fun context. So I absolutely wanted to have fun with it. But about his career, look, this is one of those things that's a gap in the story. We know that he turns up very high up in the empire. He's second to the king. The king orders everyone to bow before him. Kind of weird. Why not bow before the king? But this guy is high society, but he's an Agagite. What happened here? Where did he come from? And because we have a good question, but not a good answer in the Megillah itself, we get all sorts of options. And most of them describe Haman as achieving his fame and fortune in a kind of illegitimate way. So, okay, the thing about the barber, that's maybe not illegitimate, but it tells us that he came from not such a high society. So before he thinks too much of himself, he should remember you came from this kind of, how shall I call it, blue-collar jobs, a barber, and so on. But we also hear stories about him rising to prominence by cheating. So, for instance, there's a midrash that you find both in Jewish and in Muslim sources about Haman, that he extorted people at cemeteries. He would sit there at the gate of the cemetery. Anybody who wanted to bury someone, he would say, I'm in charge. Give me some bribe, bakshish, as they say. Give me some money, and I'll let you bury your father, son, whatever it is. And of course, people are at their worst. They're mourners, and the last thing you want to do is start haggling. So he became very, very rich by taking bribes from people who were trying to bury their loved ones. And finally, they say in this midrash, the king Achashverosh came to bury one of his own family members. He realized that this person became rich by doing this. He said, wow, this person's a genius. He's a financial wizard. How could he become rich by basically sitting in a graveyard where you would have thought the poorest of the poor are? So he said, that's it, I'm offering you a job. So again, we hear that he came from this lowly background. He managed in a very unrespectful way to rise to the ranks of the empire. And now he's high up. But therefore we have this this feeling that his success is ill-gotten. So that's just one story. But it's there because the text itself doesn't tell us, and that's how somebody was imagining. What's the worst thing we could possibly say about how he became so impressive? To say that he was the best student in his class and went to the best college and got the best. We don't want to tell this story about Haman. We want to say that he was the worst of the worst, and despite all this, he succeeded. There's stories that he was a gambler because look, he's playing with lots. Yeah, he was a dice player. He was a we couldn't even use him as a witness. So this is a guy whose background fits into what we're imagining about Haman in these different midrashim. But look, this is fun. And these are not midrashim that have many halachic implications. So as with many stories of the sort, it helps us kind of tell the story to kids and fill in the gaps. But it's I wouldn't say that these are historical facts that I'm expecting one day to find his dice under a palace in Shushan. Let's put it that way.
Your description of Esther now, and when we go and it's laned with groggers and cap guns and whatever else everybody's doing and dressed up, it just brings to mind the joke. I don't know if listeners are familiar. So there's a joke if you ask a Litvak or a Chassid a favorite part of the Megillah, and you say "V'ha'ir Shushan," end of the pasuk. And so the Litvak, you say V'yir Shushan, finish the pasuk off. So the Chassid tells you Tzalav Esamecha, and the Litvak says Navaycha,
Right.
with the Eicha tune. Yeah, exactly. It's two ways. What's the favorite part of the Megillah? Okay,
Right.
so we'll come back a little bit to Haman, and then you also talk about it. You go through. I mean, we don't have to. But you talk about his family extensively, as we mentioned. It's something you go through in depth, and then his death and all the fun sort of minhagim that have popped up, and we can talk about that, as well as, by the way, the cover of the book. What's the picture on the cover? It's the Hamantash hat. We're going to talk about the Hamantash and the hat. We have to. I can do a podcast about Haman, not talking about that. Okay, but before that, we mentioned the Septuagint, and something you mentioned that I found fascinating, I didn't know, was that the largest gap between the Hebrew and Greek is in Esther of any book in the Bible. So that's where you find the largest difference. You want to talk about that a little bit and some of the differences, because I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah. So the Septuagint, Targum Hashivim, is supposed to be a Greek version of the Tanakh. And the basic story is that a couple hundred years, maybe close to maybe 300 years before Christianity, there was a Greek king, who wanted to have every important book in his library and realized that he doesn't have Tanakh. So he commissioned a translation of Tanakh into Greek. Now, the problem is, until then, you weren't really allowed to translate the Tanakh into any language. So the story goes that 70 or 72, or however many, that's why the Septuagint, it means 70 or 72, translators were isolated in different rooms, given the same job to translate the Tanakh, and they emerged with identical translations. Therefore, this was a miraculous event, and therefore it got the kind of gushpanka, right? It had the king's seal that this is a legitimate translation, because clearly God was directing the translation project. Okay, now many Jews in the ancient world didn't know biblical Hebrew, couldn't read the text for themselves. So we're more familiar with the Aramaic Targums, but there were Jews in the Hellenistic Empire who didn't know Aramaic, they knew Greek. So for them, the Targum Shivim, the Septuagint, was their point of access to the Tanakh. The problem is that the Targum Shivim was written in Hellenistic society, and we know from the Hanukkah story that there were cultural differences between Hellenistic society and Judaism. So it's not about the Jews and the non-Jews; it's about the mityavnim Jews and the non-mityavnim Jews, those who adopted Hellenism and what that meant, sort of like westernized Jews, right? Ones who say, and those who stuck to their sources. Now, this is important because according to Hellenism, which is very logical, the Greek philosophy and that whole, Haman wasn't actually that bad in the Megillah. What did he do? He really hated Jews, really wanted to kill them, but guess what? He didn't hurt a fly. Now, this is not good enough. You can't hang a person for having bad thoughts about the Jewish people. So this was a very, very big gap in the story for somebody who's looking for Hashem to be a God of justice, who's allowing something unjust to happen. I mean, this guy, he was an idiot. He didn't like the Jews. But why are you hanging him and his family and 75,000 people? What's going on here? This isn't fair. So what the Septuagint did is it reimagines Haman and gives him or associates with him sins that are actually much more reprehensible than just saying he didn't like the Jews and had evil plans against us. So, for instance, we're told he wasn't a Gagi, he was a Macedonian, but that's not what they say. They say he was a Bugayan, which is a Greek word for a braggart. And now, being a braggart, okay, nobody likes a Schwitzer, right? But in Greek society, hubris, this idea of like puffing yourself up, this was like a cardinal sin. So the idea that Haman was a braggart, he had hubris, this is enough. We already know that this is a bad guy. Because to say he came from the wrong background, that's not Hellenism. Hellenism said, okay, each person, you could be good or bad. You don't inherit the guilt of your forefathers because Agag and Shaul. This is not a sin. So they do that. They also explain that he tried to overthrow the Persian Empire. He was a kind of a Macedonian agent sent to overthrow the king, and he tried to kill the king. So all of these things make Haman much more culpable and justify the fact that he and his kids and his supporters were eventually killed. So that, as far as Haman is concerned, is the big difference. We have a completely different character with a different background, with different CV, right? His list of crimes is totally different from what we hear in Esther. But I think the elephant in the room, or I don't know what, the camel in the room, whatever you want to say, is the fact that there's no reference to God. And there's no reference to Judaism or to religion. Haman threatens the Jewish people And Mordechai and Esther say, okay, we have to do something. Daven, say to him, well, what's going on? And we just hear about a fast day, sackcloth and ashes, right? A kind of a Tisha B'Av. But where are the things we expect to find in a situation like this? So what does the Targum Shivim do? It just fills in the gaps. It says, yep, and there was a prayer of Mordechai, and there was a prayer of Esther, and this is the text of the prayer. And yep, God was everywhere, and all these places where we would have thought there would be reference to Hashem, there are references. And some people would even say that was the original, and in the Tanakh, the references to God were taken out for all sorts of reasons. So if it falls, like I think it was Ibn Ezra says, if it falls into the hands of Goyim and then they destroy the text, it won't be blasphemy, whatever. The point is that we have different solutions to the problem that the Megillah doesn't look like a holy book should look. Okay, so if we're trying to imagine what a book of the Tanakh is, 22 books, this one looks a little bit odd. It's missing some stuff. The Septuagint just added those things in. And to the extent that they actually added 6 entire sections. Mordechai has a dream, and at the end, Mordechai gets the kind of explanation of the dream. There's an entire letter written by the king, anti-Jewish edict, and then there's the anti-Haman edict. There's the prayer of Mordechai and Esther, and so we get actual extra chapters in the Septuagint, which you don't really get in any of the other stories. I think maybe in Sefer Daniel, there's maybe a few extras, but much, much fewer than there are in this case. So a Jew reading the Megillah in Greek, a Jewish translation, and a Jew reading in Hebrew, basically are imagining different Hamans. They're imagining, they say, yeah, I hate this guy because, and each one has a different Haman in mind. Not because one of them is a biblical scholar in the 20s, because they're just reading different texts.
What about Josephus as Haman? That's another one that you discussed.
Yeah, Josephus. This guy, look, he is far more famous, I would say, in Christian circles than in Jewish ones for a completely random fact that he, according to some sources, referred to Jesus. So this is like the earliest reference, and so Christians say, this is a great text, everyone should learn it. But as far as we're concerned, he is a guy who kind of popped in and out of history. I certainly never heard of him until I started, went to college. And the thing about Josephus is that he was a Jew, but he was also part of the kind of non-Jewish elite. He was in a war. He was taken prisoner. He was taken off, I think, to Rome, and he wrote a potted history of the Jewish people for non-Jewish readers. So he's trying to present Judaism in a positive light to people who don't know anything about it. And amongst other things, he includes the Megillah story, but his story is neither completely the Megillah that we know it, nor is it completely the Septuagint. So, for instance, he refers to Haman as an Amalekite. So, Amaleki, so that's it. He must have been reading the Megillah that we know, Agagi. But he also includes aspects of the additions that we find in the Greek version. So we don't know what he was reading, but he seems to have his own spin, his own take on the story, based on maybe some very early midrashim also. But yeah, he's fascinating because he was so influential, maybe not amongst Jewish people, but amongst non-Jews, until something like the 9th, 10th century in southern Italy. There was a book called Sefer Yosipon, who claimed to be, this is the continuation of Josephus, but we know that that it was a guy who just kind of filled in the story, kind of retold it. And he was a Jew in Italy, and he also tells the story, and that's where he puts in all these 6 editions that we find in the Septuagint are there for the first time in rabbinic Judaism. So rabbis filled in the gaps with their midrashim and with their own Torah Shebaal Peh, and did not seem to know very much about the Septuagint. And now it enters into the kind of the library of medieval Judaism via Yosipon. So this kind of pseudo Josephus. But yeah, he's a fascinating character, and but not, I think he's there for the sake of completion, but he's just a stop along the way from it.
Another one is Haman in the Islamic sources, the Quran. This is something that I don't know how much of interest there is on this podcast, but this is something that, as you said, you are very interested in and you discuss in the book. So if you want to mention just some highlights or some things to note for the listeners of interest.
So of course there are something like 2 billion Muslims in the world, 2 billion Christians, and considerably fewer Jews. I think most traditional Jews have heard of Haman. I think many of those 2 billion Christians haven't heard of him, both because many Christians are not very practicing, but even within Christianity, this is a story that never really hit the A-list for all sorts of reasons. So we won't get into them. But Jews think about Haman and the Esther story much more than Christians do. But in the Quran, which is absolutely, not just the best book of the Muslim bookshelf, but the only one, Haman appears 6 times. So almost every Muslim I've ever met has heard of Haman. But the Haman they've heard of does not feature in ancient Persia with Achashverosh. He features in Egypt with Paro. And it's not just some pharaoh, he's the Paro of Moshe's time, and he's working together with Paro. Twice he's with Korach. Twice he builds a tower to the heavens. There's all sorts of stories here that resonate with people who know the Tanakh, but don't feature in the same way. So the formula in the Quran is completely different, but what the Quranic and Jewish Haman have in common is that they are anti-Jewish. They are the villain of the story. Bad things are associated with them, but beyond that, we have a completely different context. And of course, lots of midrashim, so to speak, in the Muslim world are based on the fact that he's a pharaonic, an Egyptian character, not a Persian one. What happened was Jews, for most of their history, lived in the Middle East. And eventually that Middle East came to be dominated by Muslims and Muslim culture. And, some Jews converted, but the Jews who remained Jewish were based under kind of the Islamic flag and flourished. So the Gaonim were living in Baghdad or in Iraq, and before that in Surah Pumbedita, the leading Jewish academies of rabbinic Judaism were in the Middle East. And then we get in the Middle Ages, Egypt, Alexandria, all sorts of centers. But the local culture was Islamic. So just like Jews nowadays, you could be Orthodox, but you've heard of Shakespeare, or you've heard of the Yankees. You know what non-Jewish culture is like. You like it, you don't like it, whatever. You're influenced by it consciously, subconsciously. But the culture that was dominating was this Muslim culture. And there was a lot of toing and froing between Jewish and Muslim communities. So there are even stories in the Geniza, the Cairo Geniza, of Purim celebrations where Muslims turned up and said, yeah, we hate Haman too. Let's celebrate his demise. And there was a local tax collector who was, extorting the local Jews and Muslims. And they said, yeah, this tax collector, he's Haman. Now, when the Muslims were saying it, they're thinking Haman from Egypt, the Egyptian, the pharaonic, and the Jews were thinking of a different Haman, but there was this common language. So there are huge gaps between the Haman of Islam and the Haman of the Tanakh, but there's enough there in common that they were able to kind of talk about this character as though he was a shared villain.
And despite his differences, or the differences, as you mentioned, he's still a bad character, bad apple, a wicked guy. That you see that common thread throughout. So something else you discuss is that Haman's historical development, Haman's deployment, this is something that you see throughout the literary sources, this kind of unifying common thread throughout.
Absolutely. Haman is used as a kind of a label if you want to offend someone, pretty much more than any other villain in the Tanakh, which is amazing. Because, as we said before, he didn't actually amount to much. He didn't, I imagine, in Gehenna, you've got Haman and Hitler and Stalin and Nimrod and I don't know what, Nebuchadnezzar, and they're all saying, hey, what did you do? And he's like, I destroyed the temple, the first temple. I destroyed the second temple. I exiled the Jews. What did you do? I really hated the Jews. He's a loser as far as the villains are concerned. And yet he's the one who is taken to be the kind of the poster boy for anti-Semites in history. And I think that's partially related to the fact that he wasn't the leader. He was a functionary, because most Jews never met the king. But you meet a local governor or mayor or tax collector who's mean or who's persecuting you. And he's like, yeah, this is the Haman. This is our Haman. Because we never met our Achashverosh or our Paro or our, Nebuchadnezzar. So he's always been used as the kind of label when you want to call someone else a bad name. And because Christians split, I don't want to go into this. This is not that interesting to most of your listeners, but they split into the Catholics in Rome and the Protestants, so that you had these religious wars for centuries. And the Protestants discovered that Jews referred to Haman as a Roman. because in the period of the Mishnah and the Gemara, especially just before Islam, you had Jews living in the Roman Empire, and the Pope represented Christianity, and they were anti-Jewish, and Haman was a Roman. And suddenly you have Protestants who hate the Romans and the Catholics and so on. They're like, yep, Haman was a Roman, and they had their own way of using Haman against the Catholics. So both Christians and Jews against Christians and Christians against Jews, everyone was using Haman as a label to score points against their enemy. And again, we don't find them doing it with Nimrod, who built the Tower of Babel and threw Avram into an oven. Like there are a lot of people who did a lot worse things, according to the Pshat in Tanakh. But Haman's the one who's, he's the bogeyman. He's the troublemaker.
Let's turn to the discussion that I mentioned before, and I think this is the one the listeners will find the most fun if they read the book, which is chapter 10, Haman's death. So first you talk about Haman's death in scriptures, and then Haman's death in practice. Let's talk about Haman's death before we get into the cursing Haman, the facing Haman, and crucifying Haman. There's a lot of fun stuff. But let's go Haman's death first.
Okay, so this is a good example of how different versions will tell us something else about his death. He is hanged, of course. There's this great kind of, I don't know if it's Mida Keneged Mida, because he didn't actually hang Mordechai, but it's this kind of irony where, he hangs from the very same, Eitz Gavoah Chamishim Amah that he wanted to hang Mordechai from. Okay, he's hanged. In the Targum Mashivim, he is crucified, which is incredible because then it's in Greek, and then Christians read that and they get all sorts of ideas. But let's put that aside. He is killed, and in a very public way. And this is something that's actually kind of funny, because all he wanted was to be elevated, and he ended up being elevated in a way that he probably wouldn't have wanted to be. Right? He's on the second highest edifice in the entire Tanakh after Nebuchadnezzar's golden statue. So he is mocked publicly. Everyone sees him. But again, he is killed. His sons are killed. This is something that we're meant to remember every year. And there's actually the mitzvah in the Torah that says, to efface the memory of Amalek. And from the time of the rabbis, this was a way of doing it in Purim. This is a way of fulfilling that mitzvah, is to celebrate Haman's death. And there are many ways of doing it. So, of course, hanging an effigy of Haman, this is a way of kind of modeling what happened at the time to the real Haman. But it usually never stops there. So you get the piñata effect with people, hanging him, but also, beating him up a little bit, corporal punishment. And you get the bonfire, the Lag BaOmer somehow gets in there. We're burning Haman, and then we're cutting him into pieces. We're eating Haman. We're baking parts of Haman and eating them. So he would eventually get tortured and punished again and again every year. And again, I see him in the book as a kind of a tragic villain, somebody who constantly fails at what he wants to do, and the opposite happens to him. He says, "Oh, who is the king imagining that he's going to parade me?" And he ends up parading Mordechai. All the things that he wanted to happen to him, the opposite happens. And here again, he's most successful at being punished. This is the one thing that he gets right. His death is his greatest success. But yeah, this is where it becomes very interesting for most viewers.
Yeah, you mentioned some fascinating minhagim as well. In Bukhara, they would make a snowman. It was cold there, and then they would melt the snowman into nothingness. Yeah. You would have that kind of burning. And then you mentioned in, I think it's Kurdistan, where they would burn the effigy, and then they would stone it. So you'd have burning and stoning. You'd have two types of... Exactly. Two of the Arba Mises you would go on. And then I like I will say, you refer to eating Haman. You're a final example of Hamanicide. So you talk about the eating Haman. And that talks about, well, if you could talk about that, where does that, eating Haman again, we're talking about Hamantaschen. We're going to get to the head in 1 second. But what kind of minhagim did you see about eating Haman?
Okay, so if you have to consume Haman, right, like whether by fire, one of the best ways to erase the remembrance of Amalek is to do something that literally you write the name on your shoe when you write. There are different ways of erasing Amalek, but if Haman's representing Amalek, then burning him or eating him is a way of punishing him in a way that just leaves no trace at the end. So eating Haman is another way of fulfilling that mitzvah. But also there's something triumphal about eating your enemy. Even I'm sure if you go to like Haiti or wherever, voodoo and all these kinds of cultures, the idea that you can take an enemy and eat them is a way of making it absolutely clear who's the winner and who's the loser. And you'll find this in a lot of cultures. It's called extra-cannibalism, where to prove your victory, you eat the other side. By the way, croissant in French means a crescent. And this happened when the Europeans defeated the Ottoman Empire. And I think in Vienna, the local bakery said, let's celebrate defeating the Muslims. Let's make a cake in the shape of their crescent and eat it. And that's how we have a croissant. So this is something that's kind of intercultural. But in the case of Haman, I think it's probably related to the fact that in the Middle Ages in Christian Europe, the Christians would make something called Judas's ears or Jewish ears, and they would celebrate the punishment of Judas, of course, from the Christian story, by making Jews' ears or Judas's ears and eating them. So the idea of eating your enemy's ears may well have then become a minhag also amongst the Jews. Let's make Haman's ears. But other ideas include the fact of Haman Tashin, the Haman pockets. Maybe these are pockets of, who knows? But maybe it was his hat. But anyway, I'm not complaining. I like Haman Tashin. I think it's fun. Kids like it. You could, you'd have Mun Tashin, pockets of poppy seeds that become Haman Tashin. This is kind of wordplay. But yeah, I think that there are a lot of kind of popular customs here who, Kalamar Be'erez Mishubach. Some people say Erez Misubach. I don't know. I think in this case, I like the minhag. I don't want to ask too many questions about it.
Now, what about the hat? Because you put some version of the hat on the cover. So any validity to that? That was his shape of his hat?
Yeah. So look, the hat is supposed to look a little bit like a Hamantash, and also supposed to look like Napoleon's hat. But I haven't found an ancient source that says anything about his hat. Nothing, but it was suggested by the publisher. They said, let's put Haman's famous hat on. I was like, okay, let's do it. But everyone sees that. They're like, yeah, I know what that is. That's Haman's hat. Why is it there? I can't trace this back to some sort of source, but it's associated with him, and a three-cornered hat. Even now in Israel, a kova tembel is called. You have this triangle hat. So whether you see him as a tembel, you're seen as a kind of a Hamantash shaped hat, whatever it is, it works in the sense that it's associated with Haman enough that people don't even have to ask what is that.
After this book, and there's your studies, of course, that led to this book, and like you said, the thousands of sources that you looked at, and we didn't even get into, you mentioned the Christian ones and Samaritan ones, and you go extensively in the Muslim sources as well, of course, the Jewish sources. We mentioned some of them. I mean, there's many more midrashim that we didn't mention here. What's the takeaway about Haman?
That is a really good question. The takeaway. Well, look, there are different levels at which you can see this. I mean, the basic takeaway is, it's a 300-page book. I started off thinking Haman's a bad guy, and after all this, I realized, yeah, he's a bad guy. So in terms of some sort of chiddush, like, oh, actually, he was okay. Let's say that the takeaway isn't about Haman, it's about the journey. And in going through the different ways in which people learned about Haman, described him, that tells us a lot about those people. So this is more a history of, I guess, Jews, Christians, and Muslims through the past 2,000 or 2,500 years, and what they were afraid of. Because when someone's describing their villain, they are imagining the thing that bothers them the most. Is this, was he a character who led people to have diseases and die early? Was he a character who was, a persecutor of Jewish people by extorting them with their taxes? What is the most evil thing that we can imagine? And going through this kind of development of Haman's this depiction in different communities at different times tells us what people were afraid of in history. So he's a kind of mirror to our biggest fears. Because look, I think that heroes are boring. Honestly, heroes are they never lie, and they always save the day, but villains tell us an awful lot, because you go to different cultures, and when you say what's the worst thing, some people imagine, demons, Lilith and the Shadim, and there's different ways of imagining the worst possible thing out there. And people are given this kind of blank canvas and said, draw for us your biggest villain, your biggest rival, and each person draws it, or each community draws it differently. And that's why it's filled 300 pages of a book, because Haman is this kind of reflection of what it is that that people are afraid of in history. So, yeah, that's my takeaway, that it's not about Haman. Haman's just telling us about ourselves.
It's also interesting, as anyone listens to this podcast and just even saw the title of the book or sees the title of the episode, which is like, it's a book, an analysis of a character, a central character to the Megillah, but not the regular one. It's not about Mordechai. It's not about Esther. It's about something a little different. So you can read about, the villain. Usually the feel-good stories, and you think about fantasy, right? It's always the good guy versus the bad guy. Yeah. It's always Frodo going to toss the ring into Mordor. So it's always like, wait, when do you get to see... You're not looking at it through the villain's eyes, but you're analyzing the villain. As you're saying, you're able to analyze the story that way, and you can see things differently, but it's almost from a different angle, which is quite interesting. So I'll link to the book in the show notes for those interested in purchasing the book. You can check it out. It's available at Princeton University Press's website, Amazon, and so on, so you can check it out. There'll be a link in the show notes. And thank you, Professor Silverstein, for joining me to discuss.
Thank you, Happy. I enjoyed it immensely.